Thank you. Sound okay? Yes? All right. Wonderful. Last one before our closing keynote today, so I promise we'll get through this. Thank you for staying and your patience today. Today we're talking about modifiers, the good and the camp. Just a quick introduction. My name is Spencer, pronouns he, him, his. I'm an engineering manager at a company called Movable Ink in New York City. I'm also a frequent Broadway goer, which will come up. I'm Spencer516 on Twitter and GitHub. I almost never tweet, but I like lots of things on Twitter. I think they're interesting things. And lastly, I think of myself as an amateur photographer of one dog. Her name is Eleanor, and she's delightful. Quick little, three little personal anecdotes I want to kick this off with. The first one is when I was about probably 6 years old, I fell in love with painting my fingernails. And I made a compromise with my mom at one point, was that she didn't like me painting my fingernails in public, but she let me do my thumbs. And so it's sort of my little way of expressing myself at 6 years old. And I loved doing that. Still to this day, sometimes you'll see me in meetings painting my fingers with Sharpies, and it's really hard to get off. The second thing is the first musical I ever saw was around the same time. It was a production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat at Junipero Cerro High School in San Mateo, California. For fans of fashion, that's where the model Giselle's husband played football. Fun fact. Some of you got it. And then lastly, in high school, I had a pink Zuka bag as my backpack. If you've ever seen a Zuka bag, it is this ridiculous steel rectangular contraption that has rainbow light-up wheels and functions as a chair. You should Google it. They're amazing. They're amazing bags, but I love that thing. It was absurd. Those things were sort of my personal manifestations of something called camp. Who here likes to camp? Some of you like to camp. Who here likes camp? Wonderful. That's what we're talking about today is camp. So I want to start just telling you a little bit about what camp is. These are some quotes from kind of what is considered to be the defining essay on what camp is. This is by Susan Sontag. First one is love of the exaggerated, the off, of things being what they are not. Here's a great still from a production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. This is Donny Osmond in the lead with very voluptuous long hair. People who share this sensibility are not laughing at the thing they label as camp. They're enjoying it. Camp is a tender feeling. This is a shot from a Swedish production of Billy Elliot the musical. It's a number called Expressing Yourself, where the boys decided to dress in women's clothes. And it's just a wonderful, delightful number that always ends in standing ovation. What it does is to find the success in certain passionate failures. This is a production of Titanic the musical in Georgia, where they built a set on a lake so that they could sink the ship in front of the audience. Incredible. I just love how absurd but ambitious it was. I wish I had seen it. They have actually a documentary that you can watch about this. It's wonderful. And then lastly, the whole point of camp is to dethrone the serious. Camp is playful and anti-serious. This is a shot from a really wonderful musical called Urinetown. So, of course, today we're talking about modifiers, but we're talking about the good and the camp. So we'll get into the camp a little bit later. But to kick this off, just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. The first thing is, what are modifiers? This is maybe kind of a new thing to some of you here. We'll talk a little bit about the history of modifiers, so where they come from. We'll go through some examples of how to create modifiers. We'll get into what I think might be good use cases for modifiers. And lastly, we'll get into what I think might be campy use cases for modifiers. Let's kick it off. So what is a modifier? This is a definition. I tried to come up with something. I don't think it's perfect, so would love feedback on this if you have some thoughts afterwards. But I like to think of it as a small reusable tool, like a helper, that attaches behavior to elements using lifecycle events. So if we think of classic components, so the components you're probably writing today if you're not using Glimmer or Octane stuff yet, that a classic component is made up of state and actions, plus the DOM-related things, so the element that's actually in the DOM, plus a handlebars template. And in the new world, I think what we do is we extract the DOM stuff from our components, and that goes into modifiers. What we're left is Glimmer components are concerned with state and actions. We have modifiers and handlebars as well. So I think a really great example of how you might think about modifiers is with something like autofocus. And this is actually the example that's used in the Ember guides, which is a really wonderful example. Not in that direction. Have any of you ever used the autofocus attribute on a page before? Yes? So some of you may know that there's an autofocus attribute you can use on an input, but this only works on initial page load. If you're using a single page app, that autofocus attribute isn't really going to do much for you. And you might think that it's working because you're going to refresh your page to test it, and it turns out it doesn't actually work. So instead, you need to use something like element.focus. There's a method you can call on that DOM node to say, give this input focus when the element is added to the document. So if in the old world, we would use the autofocus attribute, if this is a server-rendered application, if we had an autofocus modifier, it just becomes this. So I think it's actually a really elegant progression to the front-end world of modifiers. Some other things about what a modifier is that it usually does something that cannot be expressed by HTML alone. And so given that, one of the things you ought to know about a modifier is that Fastboot will more or less disregard them because it cannot be serialized into a string that gets sent to the user's browser. All right, let's talk about modifiers in Ember themselves, in Ember itself. Does anybody know how many modifiers have existed in the history of Ember? Before, like, recently? I hope I have the right answer. I think 2. All right, let's go with 2. So the first one that you've probably used quite a bit is a modifier called the action modifier. This is more or less the equivalent of element.addEventListener. So it lets you specify an on equals for the event type. So if you want to say on equals mouse down. But its semantics are essentially that. So you've been using it a lot. You may not have thought of it as a modifier, but that's more or less what it is. And then another one that has existed in the past, if you've been with Ember for quite some time, you might remember bind adder. Way back in the day, yes. Everyone misses bind adder. Bring it back. This was so if you wanted to add an attribute to your element, you had to use this bind adder modifier. I don't know what it was called at the time, but that's what it was. I don't miss it. One thing I do want to acknowledge is that you might be saying, well, when you're talking about modifiers, these are things we can already do, and the answer is 100% correct. Everything that we are going to see today are things you can already do in Ember, so there's nothing especially novel here. But an example of when we wanted to do autofocus. I might create a component. We'll call it my autofocus component. And then on the did insert element hook, I will say this .element.focus, which is a pretty easy abstraction, I think, to reason about. But the question becomes, how do I abstract this into something that I might be able to reuse? What I've defined here is an autofocus input. But what if I want to give autofocus to my text area? Or what if I have a special input component that I also want to give autofocus to? Now I'm going to need to specify a text area autofocus input and a my custom input autofocus input. So the composability story of things that modifiers can do was not great in the component world. One way you might have done it in the past, you might have created a mix-in. If some of you have older code bases, you might still see these around, is you would add a mix-in to your component that says extend and mix in this focus behavior. So you've abstracted the autofocus behavior, but I don't think this actually solves the problem I was talking about before of the number of different combinations you're going to have to create in order to have this autofocus abstraction. If we're talking about Octane, things actually do change a little bit, and this is where you actually will see your first modifiers. So if you're refactoring that component that used the did insert element before, the way you're probably going to end up refactoring towards a Glimmer component is to create a focus action, which accepts an element as an argument, and you'll just call focus on it. And then inside your template, you're going to use the did insert modifier. So this is very similar to the did insert element hook that you saw in components previously. So it works pretty much the same way. We've not really created a new abstraction, but very similar. So the goal we're going to have is we want to make an autofocus modifier so we can give that behavior to whatever input-like thing we want to give it to. So there's a couple ways you can make a modifier. First one is you can use the set modifier manager API. Do not recommend this. This is for the those who are brave and ready to kind of jump down into the ditches and kind of figure out what's going on. Though, if you do follow what's going on in set modifier managers, it will teach you a lot of things about how Ember works, and I think it's actually pretty cool to explore. So there are two libraries you can use. One is called Ember OO modifiers. So if modifiers are like helpers, this would be the equivalent of a class-based helper. And there's also Ember functional modifiers. This is more like a functional helper that you just give it a function. Both of these libraries I would recommend for various uses. If we were to implement this autofocus modifier in OO modifiers, you'll actually see that it looks almost identical to that component we created before. So I think this is really cool that it looks very familiar. This is not new. The way that it behaves is very similar. The important bit, of course, is that you use the did insert element hook, and you call this .element.focus. If you were to do this with a functional modifier, this you just give it a function that takes an element as its first argument when the element is inserted. And so you just say element.focus. Now that we've created this modifier, there's a couple different ways we can use it. So the first that I already alluded to before is we can just add this autofocus modifier to our input, or our autofocus modifier to our text area. But you could also add this to your mySpecialInput component. Now I did not have to define a special mySpecialInput autofocus component. I can just apply this to my mySpecialInput component. This is really deluxe, but there is one caveat you should be aware of, which is that inside your mySpecialInput component, you need to use this splattribute syntax here, which says, here's the element. If you're adding a modifier or attribute to the component when it's invoked, this is the actual element that you want to assign those modifiers or attributes to inside your component. So this works, and I think it's pretty wonderful. All right. So that's a little bit of a background of what modifiers are, how you might use them. Let's talk about what I believe to be are some of the good use cases for modifiers. A note on the format. I mentioned this earlier that I am a frequent Broadway goer. Each of these examples of what I think are good use cases for modifiers are all inspired by musicals. So get ready. This first one, of course, I think is a great example of a campy show. This is from Kinky Boots. I'm Black Jesus, I'm Black Mary, but these Mary's legs are hairy. This is a modifier I'm calling draggable. So you can see this is, I just have a little button element that I can click and drag around the screen. How I might create the API for this draggable modifier is I just have a draggable modifier that you pass in an action. And every time the coordinates update from this drag and mouse release action that you do, it will fire this action. So then inside my component, I can track the X and Y positions of that button, and as they update, I assign the X and Y values. And then what I could do with those X and Y values is just say, let's add a translate style to that button so that it moves as I drag it around. So the only thing I'd have to update in my template is just add that style to the button. And that's all you would need to make that button be able to be dragged around on the screen. What's great about that is you can apply this to any element that you can drag, which is pretty cool. All right, next up, the producers, a classic, also formerly a movie, which I recommend you see. This modifier I'm calling track on. So let's say you build an add to cart functionality in your application, and this component that you've designed here is passed in an add to cart action, and you ship it and you're happy with it. And then your product manager comes to you and says, hey, how about that mix panel tracking? And you go, ah, darn. Because you realize I would love to keep this as a template-only component, but I don't have a way of actually intercepting that action to do the mix panel tracking. And so I would have to define a new component, inject my metrics service, and then create a new action that just then calls the outer action and do this.metrics.track. And I think that's kind of poopy. That's not a great abstraction. So instead, what if we just had a track on modifier, which behaves very similar to the on modifier, but you just pass it, rather than an action, you just pass it your mix panel data that you want to send. That is track on. Woohoo! All right, next. How many people here have seen Wicked? Yes. I figured that would be a good number. It's the only one? That's why I asked it for this time. This one's for you, Rob. All right, so this next one is the modifier is called the flyover, which of course at the end of Act 1, Elphaba flies away. So this one is conceptually similar to something like Ember Tooltip or Ember Attacher, which are libraries for creating things that hover over another element, or something like Ember Popover. These are all great libraries, though the last one hasn't been updated in a while, so I may not recommend that one. But here's one issue I do take with how these work today. Is when you look at this template for Ember Tooltip, you have to put the tooltip inside the element that it's going to hover over. And it's also not clear from this template what will trigger the tooltip to show up. If you were to write this kind of without thinking about it as a tooltip that hovers over a thing, you might do it a little bit differently. You might have your component that you want to be able to hover over, and then you might have some conditional here that if I should show this tooltip thing, or the flyover, then render it. So how I might do that then is add a mouse enter and mouse leave events to that component and say show the flyover when the mouse is in it. If it's not, hide it. But then of course you run into this trouble of now how do I position that thing correctly so that it's attached to this component? So what you might do in that case is add two modifiers. So one I'm calling Launchpad. This is the thing to which you are tethered. And then the other one is called Flyover. And so that is saying this element is going to fly over and be attached to the Launchpad. So that is the Flyover modifier. All right, I have more. But we're going to do this a little bit more rapid fire. Hamilton fans? Yes. This one's called auto resize. So if you have a text area, the text area may need to grow as you're typing into it. So it might be nice to have a modifier that auto resizes as you type stuff into it. So there we've got text area auto resize. Another great show, Come From Away, a recent Tony winner. I recommend you see it if you're ever in New York. There'll be a modifier called did resize, so that if you want to know when your particular element's bounding box has changed, then you can fire an action so that you get this brand new coordinate, so you want to do something with that to be reactive. What that looks like is you would add the did resize modifier and then the action of what to do when it resizes. Really cool thing about this one, it actually already exists. This was not my idea. So check it out. Ember install Ember did resize modifier. Right, the next one, Les Mis, is a classic. Funnily enough, I was at my hotel on Saturday night, and I was looking at my talk, and I looked out the window, and I took a picture to prove it. And if you zoom in, there was Cosette staring at me from across the way. Can't make this up. So this one is called Focus Trap. If you've ever tried to make accessible modals, you know that one important thing to do is make sure there's a focus trap so that the user knows how to escape out of the modal if they need to. So Ember Focus Trap You just give it to the element in which you need to keep your focus, so it'll keep cycling through just that element until you escape out of it, is focus trap. Another fun fact, this one also exists. Check it out. Okay, let's talk about Campy modifiers. I'm doing this because I actually think that this is an opportunity. Modifiers are new, and I think we're still learning about this abstraction, and there's a lot of things for us to learn. And I think we're going to do some things wrong, and I think that's okay. And I would encourage you, especially with modifiers, is to not filter yourself with these. Please experiment and try. So let's talk about some Campy modifiers. This one is based on Spamalot. I love Spamalot. I love all these shows, if you haven't picked up on that. This is a modifier, again, I think maybe a silly idea, called scoped. This potentially solves the problem of prop drilling. If you've ever had a couple of props that you have to pass through like 12 layers of components, and it's really tedious, seems like something you might want to solve, but something where a service doesn't quite solve that because you need the service to be destroyed when that component's removed from the document. So I suppose you could do this with a modifier. So there's actually some prior art, something called Ember Provider. Some notes on this is it's not really maintained. It was more or less an experiment. It also relies on parent view inside of components, which I don't believe exists in Glimmer, so it won't even work if you're doing a Glimmer app. And this is conceptually similar to React context. So if you've worked in React before and you've used context, this is more or less the same idea. So what you might have up top is some elements, some components, a top-level document where you say, this is my provider, and it creates this scoped service for that particular tree of the DOM. And then somewhere deep, you might have, I want to consume that particular service-C thing for the life cycle that this exists. So you could do something like that with modifiers. With this, though, I think looking on the bright side, there are some real problems that this solves, but doing something like this might also introduce some new problems. For example, if you use a wormhole, this would just break. It wouldn't work. And maybe this is also just encouraging not a great pattern of global states. You're just kind of calling it something else, but it's really just a global variable. So I don't know. Might be something to try. All right, this next one. Anyone familiar with Xanadon't? Yes. Yes. It's a show where everyone is gay, except the straight people have to come out, which is a win. So this modifier is called split view. Split view. This is something that actually already exists. You can check it out. It's called Ember Split View. It uses a library called split.js under the hood. And it's actually really easy to use. So suppose you have 3 columns, and you want to be able to resize those columns, whether you're creating a code editor or something like that. All you do is add this modifier to the parent container, and you give it relative sizes. And it just works. Well, it just works. But there are some things you might run into this that are going to be a little bit unpleasant. For one, it's actually adding unmanaged elements into your document. So Glimmer or Ember is not going to be aware of these things, and that's probably going to create some issues. I see Rob grumbling in his seat right now. It also just does not handle conditional elements. So if you had an if, and you decided one of those columns should or should not be rendered, it just doesn't work. And this feels like something that if you're trying to create a shared library with modifiers, this actually might be something better shipped as a set of components that you could use. So this one I think is actually a fun idea in exploring some of the boundaries of what a modifier could do. But I think this might be a place where it might be good to take a step back and say, components are actually still pretty great. All right, next one. Who knew that Groundhog Day was also a musical? 1 person. 2 people. Doesn't count. You already saw this talk. Something, something, quantum, quantum. So this one is called predict on. So this has the same semantics of the on modifier, but it predicts. There's some prior art. There's some precedent here. There's a library called guess.js you could check out. This uses some machine learning and Google Analytics data to try to predict what a user might do on a given page. So what this might look like is, let's say we have some links on a page. And in my link to, I add this modifier, predict on, and I say, when I predict that a user is going to click on this element, fire this action. So I'll preload that flowers route. This might be really cool if you have some very serious performance concerns that you want to add into your app and you have a nice little easy abstraction. So this might be a cool one. To do it, you need machine learning, something AI. So I think it's a fun idea. If you want to build it, please let me know. I would love to use it. All right, let's talk about some rapid fire Campy modifier ideas. A classic and a favorite. Please go see this movie when it comes out. It is absurd and ridiculous, and enjoy it for what it is. This modifier is called the on modifier. So if you would like to troll your coworkers or maybe your users, please don't do that. Change the O to an O with an accent. And this will make your action fire randomly 90% of the time. Next one, another classic, Jerry Springer the Opera. Real show, and it's phenomenal. I just can't repeat any of the language in it. This modifier is called expletive emoji. So who has been in this situation where you're trying to do some layout stuff, and who sees it? Does anyone see it? Do you see that 7? Yes, the collective sigh. Oh, I hate that 7. Why is it off center? So if you add the expletive emoji modifier to your element, it draws a handy little box around it so you can see there's some extra white space you need to deal with. That is the insert expletive emoji. All right, Hello Dolly. Again, a classic. This one's actually touring right now, so if you are not in New York and you want to see this show, please check your local listings. This is a modifier called pointy cursor. This one is quite fun. It will point at the thing you're going to click on. So in your template, you have an outer container that says pointy cursor, and then the thing you want it to point at is your pointy cursor target. Pointy cursor. Please make it and ship it. I will use it. All right. We're getting through this. So I just want to do a quick recap. We talked a little bit about modifiers, their history in Ember. They've actually been around basically the whole time. You didn't know about them, but now they are a thing that you can use and you can create and add to your applications. And there's a couple different ways that you can create them today. I suggest you go try it out. There are perhaps some good use cases for modifiers. I think there are some fun ways you can explore with modifiers and push its boundaries. If you want to see these examples, I have implemented some of them. There's some, I'm sure you can guess which I have not implemented. You can check them out here. So some rules that I'll kind of attempt to loosely define about how you might want to think about modifiers. One is small and isolated is probably good. The second, bigger abstractions, if you're trying to create something complex, maybe that's where you start to get to component territory or something else. And so keep that in mind. And then please experiment and share the things that you're creating. So the thing I'd like you to think about as you're beginning to explore these things, if you hear this statement, that's a bad idea, I would like you to respond with, no, it's a Campy idea. And if you find yourself saying, that's a bad idea, I would recommend that you find some success in another person's passionate failure. I'm going to close out with a quote from another phenomenal musical, Bat Boy the Musical, based on the Weekly World News article, series of articles. Hold your Bat Boy, touch your Bat Boy, no more need to hide. Know your Bat Boy, love your Bat Boy, don't deny your beast inside. Ah, 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 ah. Thank you.